I recently found out there are categories to logic. So sometimes now if someone says that's perfectly logical, I'm going to ask them, which type of logic do you mean? Can you help me define the two big pillars of logic, classical logic and non-classical logic? And let's start with classical logic first. What is classical logic or Aristotelian logic?
Okay. So people often tend to identify classical logic with Aristotelian logic. And what you said suggests that you're making that identification. This is wrong. Okay, let's wind the clock back a little. Let's talk about the West. We can talk about the East if you want, but the revolution in logic was in the West.
Sure.
So let's talk about the West. In the West, logic was invented by the ancient Greeks, Aristotle and Stoics, who produced certain theories of what follows from what and why. The theory that Aristotle produced was called syllogistic, for want of a better term.
Yeah.
Okay. Ancient Greece was the first major flourishing development of logic in the West. The next flourishing period was the medieval period, both in the Arabic cultures and the Latin cultures. So they took their heritage from Greece and built on it big time. Okay. So they worked largely with syllogistic, and they developed it, added a whole raft of new tools. And the beast that comes out of it is very different from syllogistic. It's a much more sophisticated and powerful theory of logic. And then logic goes into a decline because it's connected with, especially in the Latin West, it's connected with scholasticism. And scholasticism gets falls out of fashion because of the Renaissance. So people actually forget many of the great gains of medieval logic in the West until roughly the second half of the 19th century, when you get the mathematicians applying the techniques of mathematics for the first time. And this is when you get what's now called classical logic invented, okay, by Gottlob Frege, Bertrand Russell, and others. Okay. Now, classical logic is a misnomer. It has nothing much to do with the logic of ancient Greece or any other great ancient culture. In fact, it's incompatible with it. There are certain things, certain inferences which syllogism says are valid, which modern logicians will tell you are not valid. So you cannot identify traditional logic, which is probably a better name for syllogistic nowadays, and classical logic. So there was this big revolution in logic, and the logic developed by Frege and Russell was so much more powerful because of its techniques than what had come before. Was that anything that come before was not exactly obsolete, but passé. So some modern logicians refuse to look at the history of logic just because it seems kind of very much outdated. That is a mistake, because there are things you can learn by looking at the ancient traditions which contain insights which got sort of pushed out the way in the modern development. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't go back and examine the ancient traditions, but as a tool of analysing what follows from what and why, classical logic was so much more powerful than what had gone before that the rest soon became history. Okay. Classical logic has then nothing to do with the classical period, but it's classical in another sense, namely it's the first sort of logic you'll learn if you study logic at a university nowadays.
Yeah.
Okay. And there are reasons for that. It's simple. You only need to be able to count up to 2 to do it, right? But it's always had problems, and logicians have always known that. So almost as soon as classical logic was invented, within the next 10 years, mathematicians and logicians were worrying about some of the problems of the new logic. And in due course, this has led to the discovery, invention, I'm not quite sure what the right word is, of logical systems which diverge from classical logic. And unsurprisingly, these are called non-classical logic. And especially in the second half of the 20th century, we've seen the development of so many non-classical logics. And a lot of this is driven by what some logicians and philosophers perceive to be inadequacies of classical logic. Whether that they are those things are inadequacies is something that philosophers debate about, and that's still a very live debate. Okay, so there are now many well-known non-classical logics. You mentioned intuitionistic logic. That's actually a creature of the 1920s, although the philosophical ideas go back to 1910s, the Dutch mathematician L.E.J. Brouwer. But the logic itself was an invention of another Dutch logician, Heiting, in the 1920s. And that's one of the earliest non-classical logics. There are others being developed around that time.
Yeah.
So by the 1950s, there were several non-classical logics known. But the big boom was the second half of the 20th century, which have taken those non-classical logics, articulated them, explored them. They've the 50 years invented lots of other different kinds of non-classical logics. So that's really, I think, the most productive area of logic nowadays. When we start to explore these non-classical logics, it's not that classical logic has gone away, but we know pretty much everything about it, except for very esoteric things which now find their life only in mathematics journals. The philosophical issues are really all in the domain of debates between classical and non-classical logic, debates between various non-classical logics, discussion of their properties and their features, discussion of their philosophical motivations. Okay, that's where logic has now been for 50 years, and it continues to, develop big time with no sign of stopping yet.
I do want to draw the distinct characteristics of these branches. So let me give you a premise. Let's say I'm saying this Lego block is white.
Mm-hmm.
In classical logic, you say you just have to count up to 2. Mm-hmm. What are the 2 possible outcomes you could have in this?
Well, the statement you just made is either true or false. That's it.
That's it.
So
in classical logic, this Lego block is white, could either be true or false.
Correct.
That's it. And the opposite of not true is always going to be false. The opposite of not false is always going to be true in classical logic.
Correct.